Do you believe in God? This is probably the most important question a human can ask or answer, and it goes hand in hand with other big questions, like if God does exist, does that mean they interact with humans in their daily life? And what even is the idea of a God? And what happens after we die? These are the questions that ultimately led to my deconstruction from a full-fledged Evangelical Fundamentalist Christian to what I'm now calling a Spiritual Agnostic Atheist. And that is what this episode of the Kayse Melone Show is all about. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Kayse Melone Show. My name is Kayse Melone, and I'm so glad you're here. Every morning, I will find 5 to 10 minutes to sit on my bedroom floor with my eyes closed. I take a deep breath to settle my body in the moment, focusing on where I'm at, what I'm hearing, how I'm feeling. I start to monitor my thoughts, watching to see what my ego seems to think is important. Sometimes I can focus enough on my breathing that I start to physically feel more alive, I swear. Like my body starts vibrating with the intensity of nothingness/everything, and my perception doesn't know what to hold on to. I try not to get scared in these moments, but my ego simply freaks the fuck out. So then I come back to the present moment and try to find that feeling again. Meditating like this is a core practice of my spiritual life, one that has changed in its underlying meaning for me over the years. I used to consider it praying to Jesus. Now, I don't really need an explanation for what's going on. I just know it brings me peace. There are many ways I think the human experience can relate to or even become that which we call divine or spiritual. This is one of my core beliefs. Nonetheless, I do not believe in God. I did for over 20 years, and I know without a doubt that I never will again. In a sense, the existence of God is the most important question we can ask about our lives because it goes right alongside with the question of why we're here in the first place and what happens after we die. Perhaps there's no right or wrong answer. Perhaps answering that question for ourselves is simply the catalyst for us to experience whatever iteration of the universe experiencing itself we're bringing to fruition in our individual lives. This question, does God exist, is fraught with the most polarized responses, and it's sure to start an online debate, no matter how uplifting I intend for this episode to you to be. Today, I want to dive into a deeply personal and, for some, a controversial topic: why I no longer believe in God. This is a conversation that's kind of been a long time coming, and I know that many of you listening may have had similar experiences or at least have questions about faith, doubt, and what it means to leave religion behind. Before I begin, I want to make it clear that this episode is not about attacking anyone who does believe in God. If faith is something that brings you comfort and meaning, that's totally valid. But for me, belief in God stopped making sense. And in this episode, I want to walk you through exactly why, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, I stepped away from the Christian faith. And I've said this on this podcast before, and I'll say it again. I have no beef with everyday Christians. I want everyone to find peace and fulfillment. And if that means believing that Jesus died on the cross to save your sins, so be it. The issue I do take is when people feel the need to try to convince others that their beliefs are invalid. The Christian church profits from the idea of spreading the good news. Okay, the more followers they have, the more money the religious leaders make. And these days, being a Christian is aligning more and more with Christian nationalism, which is a genuine threat to our way of life and our innate human dignity. And when your beliefs lead to you condemning others for their way of life, be it homosexuality or atheism, when your actions as a Christian shows you that you are belittling others for their own individual autonomy outside of Christianity, that's when I do have beef with you. Because how other people live their lives is actually none of your business. And that leads me to say, I'm not making this episode with the intention of convincing anyone to stop believing in God. My content is not for Christians who want to stay Christian. My content is for people who have already deconstructed from a high-demand religion like Evangelical Fundamentalist Christianity or even Mormonism, or people who are currently still deconstructing, or people who never grew up super religious and they're honestly just curious what it's like to grow up in these super high-demand religious environments, because it's interesting, I'll give you that much. But deconstructing from evangelical fundamentalist Christianity can be incredibly difficult, especially when it's been ingrained in you from birth. And it's not just about changing beliefs, it's about untangling your identity, your morality, and even your relationships. So if you're in the middle of that process right now, I see you, I'm with you, and I hope that by sharing my story, it helps you to feel a little less alone, because I certainly know how lonely it can feel to really start questioning your faith. So let me start with a little context. I grew up in Evangelical Fundamentalist Christianity at a megachurch here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a belief system that shaped my entire worldview. I went to the private school affiliated with the megachurch. I was there 7 days a week. I was taught that the Bible was the literal word of God, that Jesus was the only path to salvation, and that questioning these beliefs was essentially dangerous because doubt in many ways was seen as the enemy of faith. My entire moral compass was tied to what the church taught me, and the idea of living without God wasn't even an option. But over time, things started to crack. I began asking questions, small at first, but they snowballed into something much bigger. At first, I thought maybe I just needed to deepen my faith, pray more, read the Bible harder. But the more I searched for answers, the more I realized that the explanations I was given just didn't hold up. Eventually, I had to face a truth I had been avoiding or trying to avoid for a long time, which was that I simply didn't believe in anymore. I wasn't a Christian anymore. And I talk about what the whole process of deconstruction looked like for me in my previous episode. If you're interested, I'll link it in the show notes. But basically, Christianity stopped making sense to me when I realized that the Bible could not possibly be the infallible, unquestionable Word of God. I realized that it's not logical to say that on one hand, humans have agency and free will and everyone sins. But then on the other hand, no human's free will or agency got in the way of the Bible being the perfectly divinely inspired Word of God. Out of the hundreds of translators and original authors, the more I conducted a historical textual analysis of the Bible, the more I saw that everyone involved in its creation and codification had their own human-driven purposes for shaping it, most often to keep specific people, like men, in power, period, full stop. So once I stopped being a Christian, once I went through deconstruction fully, I started a period of what I call reconstruction. And this to me is the most important part of leaving the Christian faith that I think a lot of people miss. It can be easy to get lost in the totally justifiable anger at the Christian church, the anger of feeling like you've been lied to your whole life, and the anger at the religious leaders in power who profit off of people's vulnerability. But it's crucial that we don't stay lost in that anger. Religious trauma is a totally real thing that we have to deal with, and we must remember to be constructive about it. The process I call reconstruction is about, after deconstructing essentially your entire identity from the Christian influence and indoctrination, rebuilding our beliefs and values into something more authentic and aligned with our individual selves. So this is a very self-empowering process, right? So my process of reconstruction dealt a lot with whether or not I believed in God. For a long time, like for many years, I still clung to the idea of God, albeit in a new agey kind of spiritual way. And there's a lot of tenets of new age spirituality that I do agree with. I think there's a really cool shift in blending science and spirituality. But then I did also start to see that a lot of New Age spirituality was just Christianity rebranded. So I kind of distanced myself from that. And finally, I got to the point where I don't really believe or need to believe in God at all. But I still consider myself incredibly spiritual. Perhaps the most accurate description of my beliefs now is that I'm a spiritual agnostic atheist. Not that labels really matter, but that's where I'm at. And I'll dive more into what that means for me a little bit in this episode and in more detail in a future episode. But for now, I just want to talk about theism versus atheism. One of the biggest cracks in my faith in God came from the problem of evil. If God is all-loving and all-powerful, why does suffering exist? So much suffering exist. And I don't mean just personal struggles, I mean immense world-scale suffering. Children dying of starvations, natural disasters wiping out entire communities, horrific violence, and systemic oppression, to say the least. I remember being taught that suffering was a test, that God had a plan we just couldn't see. And the more I thought about it, the less that explanation made sense. If I, an ordinary human with limited power, would intervene to stop as much suffering as I could, then why wouldn't an all-powerful, all-loving God? I tried to make sense of it with a typical theological response. particularly like with free will. This might explain moral evil, though, like human choices, but then what about the natural disasters? What about genetic diseases? What about the suffering of animals who have no concept of sin? The idea that all this pain had a higher purpose started to feel more and more like a way to excuse God's inaction. This led to my belief in deism for a while. Deism is the idea that there is a God, but that he does not interact with humanity at all. Basically, that he set the universe in motion and then was totally hands-off. Over time, though, this concept broke down logically for me too. Another major reason I stopped believing in God was the complete lack of empirical evidence for God's existence. As a believer, I used to think that evidence was everywhere: answered prayers, the complexity of the universe, personal experiences. But then when I stepped back and examined these things critically, I realized that none of them actually pointed to a divine being. Take prayer, for example. We're told that God answers prayers, but when prayers go unanswered, we're given excuses. It's not God's will, or he works in mysterious ways. But if a claim is unfalsifiable, if no outcome could ever disprove it, then it's not evidence, it's just circular reasoning. Miracles. Every religion claims them. The laws of nature don't suddenly bend because someone prays hard enough. And when science has explained so much of what we once attributed to divine intervention, like lightning, disease, the origins of the universe, why should I assume that the gaps we haven't yet explained are proof of God, instead of just things we don't understand yet? And then there's the problem of this concept called divine hiddenness. If God truly wants a relationship with humanity, why is he so absent? This question haunted me for years. I was told that God was always present, that he was guiding my life, that he was answering prayers, and that I could feel his love if I only opened my heart to him. But the reality was different. I prayed, I sought, I cried out, I was weeping, always asking for an answer, and yet the silence was deafening. If God were real, why wouldn't he make his existence undeniable? If he loves us and desires connection, why does he seem so distant and so ambiguous? Why does this feel like a toxic relationship? We're not talking about a being who's merely indifferent. Most religious traditions describe God as actively seeking us out, longing for our devotion, our love, and our faith. And yet he remains elusive, only revealing himself in ways that require interpretation, leaps of logic, or blind faith. And instead of clarity, religion often frames faith as a virtue, believing without evidence, trusting without proof. But why? Why would an all-powerful, all-knowing deity demand belief in him without providing tangible proof of his presence? In any other area of life, we require evidence before accepting something that is true. We don't believe in scientific theories without data, we don't trust people without reason, and we don't follow leaders without some form of credibility, though that could be contested in the current United States political climate. And yet, when it comes to God, we're expected to suspend our critical thinking and accept that his hiddenness is part of his plan. And this kind of brings into why I consider myself an agnostic atheist, because to me, I think there's an important distinction between not believing in God versus believing that there is no God. I really, really struggle with the idea of absolute truth about anything. So to say that I know for a fact that there is absolutely nothing outside of this universe, no higher being, nothing, that nothing happens after we die, I'm so certain of it, that's not really where I'm at. I am more along the line, that's why I call myself an agnostic atheist, because it's less about being certain that nothing exists outside of this reality and more about embracing the uncertainty that comes with not believing in a God. I don't need to believe that there is 100% something or nothing outside of this reality. I don't care. I'm living my life, I'm living my day to day in such a way that it doesn't matter. Okay, so I think that's an important distinction, but moving on. Some argue that God hides himself to allow for free will, that if he made his existence undeniable, it would override our ability to choose him freely. I got that a lot growing up. But that argument falls apart quickly. If we were to follow that logic, then every form of knowledge would interfere with free will, period. We don't cease to have freedom simply because we know gravity exists or because we know that fire burns. If God wants a relationship with us, wouldn't it make sense for him to show himself clearly so that we could make an informed choice? And what about those people who spend their whole life sincerely seeking him only to receive silence in return? That was me for the longest time. This isn't just an abstract theological debate. It's a lived experience for countless people. There are devoted believers who have prayed endlessly for signs, for comfort, for confirmation, and received nothing. There are people who have cried out in their darkest moments, begging for God to reveal himself, and have only been met with silence. Are we really supposed to believe that this is a test, that this is somehow an expression of love? And I know what some of the Christians are going to say, like, I have gotten an answer when I've cried out in my darkest moments. Like, I have heard that tiny voice in the back of my head, but my thing is there is 0.000% proof that that is an external force. Why is it so impossible to accept that maybe that's your subconscious? Maybe that's part of the complexity of your brain, a part of the hard problem of consciousness, of you answering yourself. Because I've heard that little voice too. I've had really dark moments where the silence was deafening, and I've had really dark moments where I did hear a little voice in the back of my head saying, you're going to be okay. And I'm totally fine if that little voice was just me. Comforting myself. I'm totally okay with that. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that divine hiddenness, the problem of divine hiddenness, wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was evidence of absence. If a God does exist, he is either unwilling or unable to make himself known. And if that's the case, why should we be expected to dedicate our lives to searching for him? If a relationship with God is supposed to be the most important thing in existence, why is he making it so difficult? Again, that's toxic behavior. For me, divine hiddenness became one of the strongest reasons to let go of belief. I no longer wanted to twist myself into knots trying to explain away God's silence. Instead, I chose to embrace the reality in front of me, a reality where meaning is not dictated by an invisible deity, but created through relationships, experiences, and wonders of the world around me. And in that, I have found more peace than I ever did in prayer. As I started questioning, I also began looking more closely at the Bible itself. And what I found was deeply unsettling, unsurprisingly. I had always been told that the Bible was the perfect, divinely inspired word of God, a book without error, a guide to truth and morality. But the more I examined it, the more I realized that this claim simply doesn't hold up. The deeper I looked, the more contradictions, inconsistencies, and troubling moral issues I found. One of the first things that stood out to me was how the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, couldn't even agree on basic details about the most important event in Christianity, Jesus' resurrection. Who arrived at the tomb first? Was it one woman or multiple women? Was the stone already rolled away or was it moved later? How many angels were there? What did they say? These discrepancies might seem minor at first glance, but for a book that is supposed to be, again, the flawless word of God, they raise serious questions. If the resurrection is the cornerstone of Christianity, shouldn't the accounts be consistent, at the very least? And also if it was divinely inspired to write it all down. Then there's the Old Testament, oh my good goddess, which portrays a version of God that I struggled to reconcile with the idea of a loving, merciful deity. This is not a surprise to anyone. This God commands genocide on multiple occasions, ordering the Israelites to slaughter entire nations, including men, women, children, and even livestock. Take, for instance, 1 Samuel 15:3, where God commands Saul to destroy the Amalekites. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. How could I worship a God who demanded such brutality? The moral issues don't stop there. The Bible also condones slavery explicitly. In Exodus 21, God gives detailed instructions on how to buy, sell, and treat slaves, even allowing masters to beat their slaves as long as they don't die immediately from their injuries. In the New Testament, Jesus and Paul both speak of slaves, but neither condemns the practice. If the Bible were truly a timeless moral guide, wouldn't it take a clear stance against the ownership of human beings? And then there's the issue of how women are treated in the Bible, and you better believe that this will be an entire full episode, if not multiple episodes later on in the podcast. But women are often depicted in the Bible as property, given away in marriage without consent, blamed for the fall of humanity, and commanded to remain silent and submissive. In Deuteronomy 22, a woman who is raped is required to marry her rapist if she is unmarried. In 1 Timothy 2:12, Paul explicitly states that women are not permitted to teach or have authority over men. These verses didn't just seem outdated to me, they felt fundamentally unjust, even when I was a practicing Christian. It was really hard for me to square, and I kept trying to rationalize these problems. Maybe I was misunderstanding the context. Maybe I needed to have more faith, of course. But no matter how much I tried to explain them away, I couldn't ignore the simple truth. The Bible was not the flawless, divinely inspired book I had been taught to believe in. And I don't want to hear about how, well, that's why Jesus died and became the ultimate sacrifice, so we don't have to live by the laws of the Old Testament anymore. Okay, that makes no sense, okay? It just doesn't. That's just a desperate attempt at a justification that I myself used for years because I was too afraid to let go of a book that was written in ancient times. Well, some of it. And if that was the case, then what else about my faith had been built on shaky ground? And beyond the Bible itself, I started seeing Christianity not as divine truth, but as a human-made institution that has evolved over time. Doctrine has changed, interpretations have shifted, and what is considered to be quote-unquote true Christianity today would have been heretical 1,000 years ago. When I saw how Christianity has been shaped by politics, culture, and human agendas, and free will and human agency, it became harder and harder to see as divinely inspired. Also, and this is a big one, too much violence has been committed in the name of God. That is a huge reason I will never again say that I believe in God. Period, full stop. I should not have to explain this one, but I will. The bloodshed, the suffering, the wars, the inquisitions, the genocides. These stories are written into our history books and carved into the bones of humanity itself. As a species, we carry the trauma of our ancestors deep in our subconscious, even when we don't realize it. Wars fought over divine mandates, colonial conquests justified by divine providence, please see Manifest Destiny, people burned at the stake for daring to challenge religious dogma or for just being a woman. This is the legacy of the word God. It would be one thing if these atrocities were only remnants of a bygone era, if the violence in the name of God had faded with the Dark Ages like a lot of people claim, but it hasn't. The echoes of religious tyranny are still with us. They whisper in laws that police women's bodies, in policies that deny LGBTQIA+ people the right to safely exist, and in the justifications of war crimes and ethnic cleansing. Oh my good goddess. They manifest in the way we teach children to fear eternal damnation for asking the wrong questions. Some argue that reclaiming the word God, reshaping it into something beautiful and forgiving, could be a powerful act of resistance against oppression and systemic violence. And I understand that instinct. Language evolves and the meanings of words shift over time, but I wonder if it's time to let this word drop altogether. The history of the word God is inseparable from oppression. For thousands of years, religion has been used as a weapon against those deemed unworthy, undesirable, or simply inconvenient. Women have been subjugated in the name of God for millennia. Entire theologies have been constructed to strip them of power, to keep them obedient, silent, and small. Biblical passages were wielded to justify marital rape, to deny women education, to enforce purity culture that shackled them to the desires of men. Even today, in many religious communities, women's autonomy is still framed as a threat to the divine order. LGBTQIA+ people have been hunted down, imprisoned, tortured, and killed because of what religious doctrine declares about their existence. Even in more progressive faith communities, queerness is often seen as something to be tolerated rather than fully embraced. And let's be honest, no one is 100% straight. I will not be taking questions at this time. I've said this before and I'll say it again. You can claim that your belief is not about following the rules, it's about a relationship with Jesus Christ. But then if that means that you make this claim and then you're upset when like two men are having sex, guess what? You might be gay. That's all I'll say. The system of slavery in the United States was upheld in the name of God. Christian slaveholders cited scripture to justify their ownership of human beings, preaching that Black people were destined to serve. The legacy of that religiously sanctioned racism still lingers in the structures of systemic oppression today. Churches that once defended slavery went on to resist civil rights, to uphold segregation, to subtly or not so subtly support policies that keep power in the hands of the privileged. And right now, Zionists are using the divine decree of a promised land to justify genocide in the Middle East. The idea that a group of people has a God-given right to statehood, regardless of the suffering it inflicts on others, is one of the most dangerous and persistent forms of religious extremism. It's a reminder that belief in divine authority can be wielded to silence dissent, to rationalize ethnic cleansing, and to wash the blood from guilty hands. How much longer will we let God dictate such atrocities? At some point, we have to ask ourselves, what are we actually referring to when we invoke the word God in the first place? Are we speaking about a cosmic force of love and unity? Or are we inadvertently invoking centuries of bloodshed and oppression? Even when we try to redefine it, the weight of its history remains. For those who grew up in religious trauma, the word God can never be neutral. It carries the echoes of every sermon that made them feel unworthy, every scripture that justified their oppression, every time they were told that their suffering was part of some divine test. Even outside of direct religious abuse, the cultural weight of the word God remains heavy. Governments still justify laws with religious rhetoric. Courts still swear oaths on holy books for some good goddess damn reason. Presidents still end speeches with God bless America. Who's blessing America? Not God. I don't see it. Reinforcing the idea that divine favor is tied to national identity. Even in progressive spaces where the word God is reframed as something more inclusive, the problem persists because the word God does not exist in a vacuum. It cannot be detached from its history. But here's the thing. Rejecting the word God doesn't mean rejecting spirituality altogether. It doesn't mean rejecting a sense of meaning and purpose. It doesn't mean rejecting wonder or connection to something greater than ourselves. It simply means recognizing that this particular word, this construct, has caused too much harm to be salvaged. If we strip away the religious framework, what remains? We are left with the raw, unfiltered awe of existence, the mystery of the universe, the feeling of being connected to something vast and incomprehensible, not because a deity demands it, but because it is simply our nature to seek and create meaning. For some, that connection is found in science, in the intricate beauty of the cosmos. Now, science is not perfect in itself, and I'll get into that in later episodes, but still, for others, this connection is found in meditation, in art, in the collective energy of human experience. Whatever we call it, consciousness, the universe, the infinite, it does not require the baggage of the word God to be profound. Some may argue that reclaiming the word God is worth the effort, that we can redefine it, reshape it into something more compassionate and inclusive. And I respect that. But I also question whether a word, again, so deeply embedded in systems of violence can ever truly be cleansed. Maybe it's time to let it go. Maybe it's time to speak in new terms, to craft a language that reflects our values without carrying the weight of centuries of suffering. Maybe the divine, whatever that means to each of us, deserves a name untainted by blood. I'm no longer interested in justifying or defending a word that has been used to justify and defend so much harm. I am not here to reclaim the word God. I'm here to move beyond it. And maybe, just maybe, the world will be better for it. The thing is, I still worship this idea of divinity, this idea of spirituality. And that's very true. I worship the divinity of the smallest snail, moving through blades of grass towering over it. I worship the divinity of laughter among my groups of friends. I worship the divinity of myself because I am a being that exists and moves through this reality. And that to me is enough of a beautiful, powerful mystery to consider it sacred. I don't need a creator to make me feel special and loved because I love myself. That sentence alone would be heresy in the religious world I left behind. To love oneself without condition, without the validation of an external deity, was considered arrogant, selfish, and even sinful. The entire framework of belief was centered on the idea that we, as humans, were inherently flawed and in need of redemption from a force beyond ourselves, that we could not trust ourselves, that our hearts were wicked and our desires deceitful and our souls in need of saving. This idea is one of the most damaging aspects of the God concept, the way it separates us from our own divinity, making us look outward instead of inward for truth, purpose, and love. The very structure of religions that is built upon otherness, a being outside of us, a power beyond us, a morality imposed on us rather than discovered within, I believe that is where religion fails. Divinity is something to be found within, not bestowed from above. When we bow to this idea of an otherworldly creator being, we let go of our personal accountability for the divinity that is life itself. And this is the same for the belief in a devil. When we attribute divinity or evil to something outside of ourselves, as if it must exist outside of us, as if it is something to be earned, gifted, or granted, rather than something we already possess, to me, that misses the point altogether. The moment we externalize divinity, we separate ourselves from it. We turn it into something unreachable, something we must constantly seek and beg for and prove ourselves worthy of. And in doing so, we deny ourselves the truth that we are already divine and spiritual and powerful, just by existing, just by breathing, just by being. That is not to say that reverence and wonder are meaningless. On the contrary, I experience profound reverence every day. But my reverence is not directed toward a cosmic judge, a creator in the sky, a force that stands apart from me and the world around me. My reverence is directed toward experience itself, toward the movement of time, the depth of human emotion, the unexplainable magic of consciousness. I find divinity in the way the sky changes colors at dusk, in the way music can make my entire body vibrate with emotion, in the way people love each other despite how fragile and fleeting life is. The traditional idea of God is not just external, it is hierarchical. It places divinity at the top and humanity at the bottom, a structure of power where we are dependent rather than inherent. This model strips us of our agency, making us subjects rather than individual creators, servants rather than our own autonomous sovereign beings. This is why religious structures so often seek obedience above all else. If God is the sole source of divinity, then we are meant to submit, to question our own intuition, to deny ourselves, to diminish our personal power in favor of a force we are told is higher, greater, and more worthy than us. But what if we refused to externalize our own innate sacredness? What if we saw ourselves as holy, not in a way that elevates us above others, but in a way that affirms our intrinsic worth? What if we stopped looking for an outside force to give our lives meaning and instead embraced the simple, profound reality that we are here and that is enough? For me, that shift was everything. It was the moment I stopped waiting for a divine plan and started creating my own. The moment I stopped needing permission to exist fully. The moment I realized that I am the author of my own story and I do not need a God to make my life sacred. The word worship, let's talk about that. The word worship itself has been tainted by the idea of hierarchy, of bowing down before something greater. But I still worship, not in the sense of submission, but in the sense of celebration. I worship the divinity of connection, of kindness, of creation, of life itself. I worship when I stand in awe of the ocean's vastness. I worship when I hold the hands of my friends and feel their warmth. I worship when I dance, when I cry, when I let myself be fully alive without shame or fear. And most importantly, I worship myself, not in arrogance, but in recognition, because I am here and you are here. I am thinking, feeling, learning, growing. I am capable of love. I am part of this universe made from the same atoms as stars, and that is divine. And you are divine too. The idea of God tells us that we are separate from the divine, that we must reach for it, strive for it, prove ourselves worthy of it, but I reject that. I believe in you. Yes, you, listening and watching this right now, I believe that you are divine. Period, full stop. Not because you follow a set of rules, not because you adhere to a prescribed faith, not because you seek approval from a higher power, but because you exist. Your life is your own divine creation, and I witness the awe and majesty of it. I am grateful for it, and I am grateful for you. So, if you take nothing else from this, take this. You do not need a God to be sacred. You already are. On to the next reason I don't believe in God. Hello, welcome to 2025. In case you haven't noticed, we're living in modern times. By now, we're all well-versed in the common explanation that our ancient ancestors, in their quest to understand the world around them, personified the forces of nature. They named them, gave them identities, and assigned them stories that reflect the human experience. In summation, the idea of God is anthropomorphic. The sun wasn't just a ball of fire. It was the god Helios, a male god riding a golden chariot across the heavens. The moon wasn't just a celestial body to our ancestors. It was Diana, a goddess who watched over the night. The wind had a name. The ocean had a name. The fertility of all living things, she had a name too. But it didn't just stop at giving them names. These forces of nature weren't just personified, they were humanized. They had personalities, emotions, desires, flaws, all traits that we as humans see in ourselves. Zeus was jealous and vengeful, throwing lightning bolts at those who angered him. The God of the Old Testament wasn't much different, demanding loyalty, testing his followers, punishing those who disobeyed. Athena was wise, strategic, and cunning, much like the people who worshipped her hoped to be. Are we really that surprised that this habit of anthropomorphizing, which means assigning human traits to non-human things, has followed us all the way into the modern concept of God? Because honestly, we shouldn't be that surprised. It makes sense why ancient civilizations did this. The world was mysterious, chaotic, and often terrifying. To make sense of it, they projected their own emotions and behaviors onto nature itself. A violent storm must mean an angry god. A bountiful harvest must mean a pleased goddess. But here's the thing, we still do this. We still speak about God as if it's an entity with opinions, preferences, and emotions. We say things like God is loving, God is angry, or God wants you to do this and not that. Think about that for a second. We have taken something that is supposed to be beyond human understanding, beyond time and space, beyond the physical laws of reality, and we've squeezed it into this human-like form, a being that thinks, feels, judges, forgives, rewards, and punishes. And yet, we don't seem to question it. Some might argue that modern spirituality has evolved past this, that we no longer see God as an old man in the sky throwing lightning bolts, that instead, God is an abstract, formless, omnipresent energy, but even that idea still carries anthropomorphic undertones. If God is a formless energy, why do we assume it cares about us? Why do we believe it wants anything at all? Why do we think it has a plan or a purpose for us? Wanting, caring, planning, these are all human traits. They require thought, intention, desire. They are based on personality. So even when people say, I don't believe in an old man in the sky, I believe in a loving universal presence, they are still in a way projecting human emotions onto something vast and incomprehensible. Why would the universe have emotions? Why would existence itself love or forgive? Why do we insist on making the divine something that resembles us? This is the part that specifically bothers me about the word God, not just because it carries centuries of systemic baggage, though it certainly does, but because it inevitably implies personhood. Someone might argue, well, I use the word God, but I don't mean it in the old-fashioned human-like way. I mean it as an expansive, non-anthropomorphic sense. And to that I say, that's impossible. The moment you use the word God, you evoke centuries of humanization. You invoke the idea of an entity that thinks, feels, and acts with intention, whether you mean to or not. The word itself is too loaded to be detached from its anthropomorphic roots. Even if you strip away the religious dogma, even if you redefine it to mean the universe or consciousness or oneness, you are still clinging to an idea that insists on some form of divine personal identity, like as in a deity. But what if we didn't need to assign a personality to the vast, mysterious forces of existence? What if we didn't need to assume that reality itself cares about us, has a plan for us, or wants anything at all? What if instead of reaching for a word like God, we simply accept what is without needing to make it resemble ourselves? Because here's the truth. The universe does not think like a human. It does not have opinions. It does not experience emotions. It does not reward or punish. It simply is. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maybe we don't need a God at all. As humans, we have an insatiable need to explain the world around us, and I get that. We look for patterns, uncover connections, and seek out causes and effects. This ability to question, analyze, and interpret is one of our greatest strengths. It has propelled us to explore the cosmos, cure diseases, and solve some of the most intricate problems imaginable. But not everything can be explained. Some mysteries remain beyond our grasp, and for those unknowables, humanity has often turned to the concept of the divine, or the concept of a God. When answers escape us, we fill the gaps with meaning, with stories, with faith. I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, I think it's beautiful, in a sense. Throughout history, what was once considered unknowable has often become known later on. Lightning, once believed to be a weapon of the gods, is now understood as an electrical discharge. Diseases, once attributed to divine punishment, is now explained through microbiology. The further we advance, the fewer mysteries we have left to ascribe to a higher power. So what happens when the unknowable shrinks? What happens when more and more of what we once called divine is revealed to be natural, predictable, and measurable? Does the need for a belief in God diminish as well? I think it might. But that doesn't mean we lose everything that came with that belief, because spiritual practices have existed for millennia, passed down through generations under different names and in different cultures. Meditation, surrender, forgiveness, these are not exclusive to any one religion or deity. These are human practices rooted in the way we experience consciousness, emotions, and relationships. For much of history, these practices were taught alongside belief in a god or gods. People were told that surrendering to the divine was necessary for peace, that forgiveness was a commandment from a higher power, and that meditation was a means of connecting with something greater than the self. But does that mean these practices require a belief in God to be effective? I don't think so. For years, I believed that surrendering, forgiving, and living intentionally required a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. That these things had power only because they were part of a spiritual system ordained by something greater than me. But as I've stepped away from traditional religious belief, I've discovered something pretty surprising, or maybe unsurprising. These practices work just as well, if not better, without God. I still practice the attitude of surrender, but now I surrender not to an unseen force, but to reality itself. I accept the ebb and flow of life without needing to believe that a divine hand is orchestrating it all. I still forgive, but now forgiveness feels more real, more profound, because I am not forgiving out of an obligation or religious duty. I forgive because I choose to, because I understand the weight of resentment and the freedom of letting go. I still practice presence, but now I don't seek presence as a way to be closer to God. I seek it because this moment is all I have, and that realization is enough. For some, belief in God enhances their experience of spirituality, and I get that. It gives them a framework, a sense of connection, a deeper motivation. I respect that. Honestly, I do. Again, I'm not trying to convince anyone to stop believing in God. But for others, myself included, the idea of God can actually be a distraction. It can complicate the very things that are meant to bring clarity and peace. If I spend my time wondering whether I'm pleasing a deity, whether my surrender is correct, or whether my forgiveness meets some divine standard, I am no longer truly practicing surrender or forgiveness. I am simply following a rule book. By removing the need for God from my spiritual practices, I have found freedom. I have discovered that life is worthy of reverence, not because it was created by a higher being, but because it is. So is a belief in God necessary? I don't think so. But that doesn't mean you can't believe. Again, it simply means that belief in God is optional, not a requirement for meaning, peace, or fulfillment. The practices that have brought people joy and wisdom for centuries are still available to all of us, whether we believe in a higher power or not. For me, life is sacred because it exists. It's that simple, not because it was created by something divine. And that realization has been more than enough. Now I'm going to talk about one of the main reasons I don't believe in God anymore. And this is obviously, for obvious reasons, like one of the most important reasons for me. I cannot tell you how many times I've had a variation of this conversation with a man. It usually goes something like this. Him. Yeah, I believe in God, but in a spiritual way, not a religious way. Me. I respect that, but I can't bring myself to use the word God because I think it places the masculinity of God the Father above femininity. Him. Oh, well, obviously God is genderless. The idea of God the Father is just a construct. Me. So why don't you say goddess? Why don't you say goddess instead? Or why wouldn't you default to a term that's actually gender neutral, like spirit or source? Is it perhaps because you're still unconsciously using a word that brings you, a man, the most power? And of course, he'll say, I mean, that's just how I mean it, as genderless. It doesn't mean I think men are more divine than women. And to that, I always say, that seems awfully convenient, but okay. Did you know that the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, had a wife? According to ancient Israelite mythology, her name was Asherah, and at one point she was worshipped alongside Yahweh as a divine counterpart. Artifacts, inscriptions, and historical texts suggest that the early Israelites acknowledged both a masculine and feminine aspect of the divine. And yet, Asherah was erased. Purposefully, as monotheistic traditions solidified, the feminine was stripped away and the singular masculine god took center stage. The idea of a goddess was systematically removed from religious texts, practices, and doctrines. So I'm going to ask you this: where did the goddess go? And more importantly, why does it matter? Some people argue that referring to God in masculine terms is harmless. They claim it's just linguistic habit, a cultural convention with no real implications, but I don't buy it. Language shapes perception, and perception shapes reality. When the divine is consistently referred to as masculine, as he, him, as God the Father, whether consciously or not, it reinforces the idea that masculinity is superior, more powerful, more authoritative, more divine. And if someone intellectually believes that God is genderless, their language still upholds the hierarchy of patriarchy. And let's not pretend that hierarchy and patriarchy doesn't spill over into the rest of society. For centuries, masculinity has been elevated, idolized, and positioned as the default, whether in religion, politics, or philosophy. From the very first moments of Western civilization, we've been conditioned to see power, leadership, wisdom, and divinity as masculine traits. Meanwhile, femininity has either been reduced to a secondary role or dismissed altogether. And the consequences of this erasure are everywhere. Women have had to fight for centuries just to be acknowledged as spiritual leaders, priests, or theologians. Entire religious traditions have justified the oppression of women based on the belief that God created man in his image first. Femininity, when it does appear in spiritual discourse, is often framed in terms of submission, passivity, and receptivity, never authority, sovereignty, or power. And yet, every culture in history before monotheism took hold had a goddess. Long before the idea of a single male god dominated religious thought, humanity worshipped the divine in both masculine and feminine forms. The earliest spiritual traditions revolved around the Great Mother, the giver of life, the source of creation, the protector and the destroyer. In ancient Egypt, Isis was revered as the mother of all things. In Sumer, Inanna ruled over love, war, and wisdom. In Greece, Gaia was the very earth itself, the foundation of existence. In Hinduism, Shakti remains an essential, powerful force of creation. The goddess wasn't some minor figure or afterthought. She was primary, she was essential, she was everywhere. But as patriarchal systems took hold, the goddess was pushed aside, rewritten, and in many cases erased altogether. What remained was a masculine god ruling alone, a father without a mother, a king without a queen. I refuse to accept that the only way to describe the divine is through a masculine lens. I refuse to participate in a system that has erased half of divinity, half of humanity, and half of me. We all have masculine and feminine traits within us, but again, when you reinforce from birth that God is a he, him, that God is a father, and you have these little girls in Sunday school, it starts affecting their psychology from day one to see the masculine as more aligned with divine than them. There's no surprise that women being submissive to their husbands in the Christian church has been upheld for all of this time because, again, when you from birth are reinforcing this idea that Jesus was the 100% man and 100% divine, which is a concept that I was told all of the time, that reinforces the closer alignment of masculinity with divinity. And so I'm always asking, why wasn't Jesus a hermaphrodite? Why wasn't Jesus androgynous? And unless it's because God the Father and Jesus the Son, these two constructs have been upheld over time because it gives men more power in the church. Using the word God to describe all that is benevolent and good and divine without acknowledging its masculine connotations is an incomplete truth. It's an unbalanced equation. Why should I uphold a view that continues to prioritize masculinity over femininity? Masculinity is already worshipped in every aspect of society, in leadership and philosophy, in history and spirituality. It's given dominance in nearly every major religion. It's revered in politics. It's positioned as the default, and I will not add to that. If the divine is truly beyond gender, then why is God always assumed to be male? Why is it so difficult to say goddess instead? I have 100% transitioned to saying oh my goddess instead of oh my God. And sometimes people are like, why would you say that? Why does it matter? And I'm like, well, honestly, if you can't understand why it's important, then I have nothing to tell you. Why does the masculine still hold a monopoly on the sacred? When I speak of the divine, I will not erase the feminine. I will not default to a term that excludes me. If God is just a construct, then so is the assumption that divinity must be expressed in male terms. If we are to reclaim a truly holistic understanding of the divine, we must restore the balance that was lost. We must recognize that divinity is not solely masculine or feminine, but both and beyond. That starts with language. It starts with the words we choose to describe the sacred. If you believe that God is genderless, then use gender-neutral terms: source, spirit, the divine, the universe. If you want to reclaim the feminine, say goddess, say mother, say she. That's what I'm doing. But don't pretend that calling divine he is neutral. It's not. It's centuries of conditioning, centuries of erasure, centuries of imbalance. I am no longer willing to participate in that erasure. So when someone tells me they believe in God but mean it in a genderless way, I challenge them. I ask, then why not say goddess? Why not say something that actually reflects the balance? And if the answer is discomfort, if the answer is hesitation, then we found the real problem. It's not that God is just a convenient term, it's that the masculine still holds power, and deep down, some people aren't ready to let it go. And I know I'm going to get a ton of comments on this section and call me an angry feminist. I don't give a flying fuck. Moving on. It's important to acknowledge that the idea of believing in God will never sit well with me again. I get that. No matter how I try to approach it, the very concept is too deeply entangled with the high demands of fundamentalism that once ruled my life. It's not just about doctrine or theology, it's about the pressure, the guilt, the suffocating expectations that came with it. Even now, long after leaving that world behind, I can't separate the belief from the harm it caused me. I know this isn't entirely fair, but I'll admit it anyway. Whenever someone tells me that they believe in God, whether they are Christian, Muslim, Mormon, or any other religious tradition, a small part of me stops trusting them. It's an involuntary reflex, one that I can't quite shake no matter how much I try to work through it. I recognize that this reaction isn't rational. I know that there are deeply kind, compassionate, and fulfilled people who believe in God. Many of them live their faith in ways that bring them peace and purpose, never using it to harm or control others, and yet my instinctual distrust remains. I don't want to be this way. I don't choose to feel this way, but when someone expresses a belief in God, my mind immediately flashes to the rigid, oppressive system I once belonged to. The system that told me what to think, how to live, what was acceptable, and what would damn me for eternity. It was a system that demanded obedience, not understanding, love, but only under strict conditions, faith, but never questions. For years, I built my life around pleasing an unseen force, one that always seemed just out of reach, always demanding more, always ready to punish me if I got wrong. It wasn't just about belief, it was about submission, and the weight of that submission crushed me, especially as a woman in the church. So when I hear someone say they believe in God, no matter how gently or inclusively they frame it, my body tightens, my mind goes on alert, because I've been there before and I know where that road can lead. I've tried to intellectualize my way through this, to reason with myself and find a way to separate my personal experience from the broader concept of faith. I understand that not all religious belief is inherently harmful, that spirituality can be expansive and freeing for some people, but no matter how much I analyze it, I always come back to the same conclusion. I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't unfeel what I've felt. I sometimes wonder if this bias of mine negates everything else I've reasoned about my religious upbringing, about basically everything I've just talked about in this episode. If my distrust of belief in God is so deeply personal, does that mean my criticisms of religion are invalid? Does my past trauma make my arguments less objective, less rational? Honestly, maybe. But even if that's true, I still stand by what I feel. I stand by my right to reject a belief system that once tried to break me. I don't need to intellectualize my way out of this. I don't need to justify my discomfort. It's real, it's valid, and for me, it's enough. So here I am, telling you all of the reasons why I'll never believe in God again. And yet, I still worship that which is divine or spiritual. How can I square that? I worship the divine in you and in me. I see it in your eyes, even when they're sad as you tell me you don't know why you're alive. I see the purpose of everything in those eyes when they light up because someone complimented your outfit. To me, community is divine. Creativity is divine. Curiosity is divine. I think it's okay to hold value for the archetype of divinity or spirituality without letting the idea of God control our waking thoughts. Mythology is a tool for humanity to hold space for the vastness and abundance and unexplainability of this reality we live in. It's a way for us to access that which is universal for all of us through the lens of storytelling. So I'm okay with saying things like, the universe has my back, or my inner spirit doesn't align with that job title, because I'm intentional about being open with the possibilities and the potential of a contemplative spiritual life. I don't need it all to be quote-unquote real. I'm okay with drawing my own meaning from those words. You'll notice that almost all of my reasons for no longer believing in God have to do with the interpretation of the word God itself, because the word God is dead. I recently reread Friedrich Nietzsche, and I wonder if that's kind of what he actually meant when he said God is dead. Language is the fundamental construct of humanity, and not just the spoken vernacular, but also nonverbal communication, digital messaging, and even the self-talk that is wordless in our own heads. Language is how we navigate absolutely everything in this world, but it also, by definition, limits that which we're talking about. As soon as we define something as a rabbit, we are simultaneously describing everything else as not a rabbit. For that reason, when we're talking about all that is, divinity itself, the universe, and beyond, the word God is no longer an option for me. It's too convoluted, it has too much baggage, and believers of God have wrought too much violence on this world. Above all that, though, I don't think there can possibly be an accurate description of what we're talking about when we use any of these words like God, divinity, spirit, or even infinity. Because by default, when we describe something or label it, we limit it. And in order to build a new world, one that can start over, one that the young people can feel empowered to grow in, I think we need to start deconstructing and then reconstructing the language we use. For me, that starts with developing a meaningful secular life in which I pursue spiritual practices, all without the anxiety that comes with believing in God. A secular approach to spirituality does not reject the search for meaning, inner peace, or moral development. It simply removes the need for religious belief as a prerequisite. This approach has several key advantages over religiously based systems when applied to politics and culture. While religion has historically played a role in shaping human civilization, it is not necessary for spirituality, morality, or governance. A secular approach to spirituality offers a more peaceful and ethical way to structure our political and cultural systems. By focusing on universal ethics, inclusivity, cooperation, and critical thinking, secular spirituality fosters a society that is more just, adaptive, and harmonious. By moving beyond religious dogma, we open the door to a world where ethical decisions are based on reason and compassion rather than ancient texts and supernatural beliefs. This shift not only reduces division and conflict, but also allows for a more flexible and inclusive approach to spirituality, one that enhances human well-being without the constraints of religious exclusivity. A society rooted in secular spirituality is one that values wisdom over dogma, justice over tradition, and unity over division. It is a society where all individuals, regardless of belief, can seek meaning, connection, and ethical fulfillment in a way that serves the common good. One of the hardest parts of leaving faith for me was overcoming fear. Fear of hell, fear of being wrong, fear of losing my sense of meaning, fear of losing my community. Fear had been woven into my belief system from childhood, shaping how I saw the world, my actions, and even my thoughts. The idea that doubt was dangerous and that questioning could lead to eternal punishment created an internal battle that, was difficult to escape. But as I slowly stepped away from my faith, I realized something profound. I wasn't losing meaning, I was redefining it. In religious settings, meaning is often presented as something external, a purpose handed down from a divine being, written in sacred texts, and reinforced by tradition. We are taught that without this externally defined purpose, life becomes empty, directionless, and nihilistic. That idea kept me tethered to a belief in God long after I had serious doubts. I feared that walking away would leave me in a void, unmoored from everything that had once given me stability. But as I began to truly examine what meaning was, I realized that it had never been something handed down to me. Meaning had always been something I was creating, even within my faith. Morality doesn't come from a book. This was another difficult realization for me. For so long, I had been taught that right and wrong were dictated by divine command, that without God, there was no objective morality, no foundation for goodness. And yet, as I stepped away from religion, I found myself just as committed to kindness, to empathy, and to love as before, perhaps even more so. Because now these values weren't tied to the hope of reward or the fear of punishment. They were worth pursuing for their own sake. And this is key. I get asked by Christians all the time, time. If I don't believe in God or absolute truth, then how can I know the difference between right and wrong? If I believe that good and evil are simply useful constructs that humanity created for itself, which I do, how can I set up a society that is progressive and worthwhile and loving? To that I say this: if you need to believe in a God or absolute truth to act in kindness and love, I honestly pity you. Because I don't need those things. Atheists don't need those things to be good citizens who stand up for the innocent and do no harm. As I went through my own deconstruction journey, I started asking myself, do I need a sacred text to tell me that hurting others is wrong? Do I need the fear of divine judgment to push me to be compassionate? The answer was a resounding no. Morality, I came to understand, is rooted in our shared humanity. We are social beings, and our survival has always depended on cooperation, trust, and care for one another. The golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, existed long before any religious doctrine codified it. Empathy is wired into us. If anything, stepping away from faith made my sense of morality stronger. I was no longer following rules out of obligation or fear, but because I genuinely cared about the well-being of others. I was no longer confined to a rigid moral code that often seemed arbitrary or outdated. Instead, I was free to engage in an ongoing, evolving process of ethical reflection, learning, and growth. My purpose now comes from living fully, connecting with others, and embracing the unknown instead of fearing it. In faith, so much emphasis was placed on the afterlife, on what came next, on ensuring my eternity was secure. But what about the life I was living right now? If I was constantly worried about securing a place in heaven, was I fully present in the life I was experiencing on earth? The realization that this life is all I know for certain was both terrifying and liberating. Let me ask you this: if you knew for a fact exactly what happens after we die, would you be living any differently? What if there was no way to know? Would you live any differently? Because basically, I got to the point where I wanted to live in such a way that I would be proud of and fulfilled in my life no matter what happens after I die. I want to live in such a way that promotes kindness, joy, and unity, and I don't need to believe in a higher power or an afterlife to strive for that. Instead of seeking purpose as an external divine plan, I started finding it in everyday moments, in the joy of deep conversation with friends, in the beauty of a sunset, and the act of creating something new. I found it in the kindness of strangers, in the laughter of loved ones, in the simple pleasure of being alive. My purpose was not something waiting to be discovered in a holy book or a sermon. It was something I could build every day through my choices, my passions, and my relationships. And as for spirituality, I still feel deeply connected to the universe and the mystery of existence, but now that connection feels more honest. When I was religious, my spiritual experiences had to fit within a predefined framework. If I felt awe at the vastness of the night sky, it was supposed to be evidence of God's majesty. If I felt an overwhelming sense of love, it was attributed to the presence of the divine. But what if those experiences were simply part of being human? What if awe, wonder, love, and connection don't need supernatural explanations? Now, when I look at the stars, I don't see them as proof of a creator. I see them as ancient light traveling across incomprehensible distances, remnants of a universe that existed long before me and will continue to long after I'm gone. That thought doesn't make me feel insignificant. It makes me feel deeply connected to everything that has ever been and ever will be. I don't have all the answers, and I'm okay with that. In religion, not knowing was often seen as a failure of faith. Doubt was something to be overcome, uncertainty was something to be feared. But I have come to love the not knowing. The universe is vast, complex, and filled with mysteries we may never fully understand, and that's beautiful. Letting go of religious certainty has allowed me to embrace curiosity in a way I never could before. I don't need to have definitive answers about the nature of existence to appreciate life's depth and complexity. I don't need a divine plan to find meaning in the relationships I build, the knowledge I seek, and the joy I experience. Leaving faith was not easy. It required me to confront deeply ingrained fears, to question beliefs I had taken for granted, and to rebuild my sense of identity from the ground up. But in doing so, I found something richer, something more authentic. I found a morality rooted in empathy rather than dogma, a purpose built from lived experience rather than divine decree, and a spirituality grounded in reality rather than imposed narratives. I am no longer afraid of the unknown. I no longer feel the need to cling to certainty at the expense of truth. Instead, I move forward with open eyes, an open mind, and an open heart, ready to embrace whatever comes next, not because I have been promised an eternal reward, but because this life, this moment, is enough. And that wraps up this episode of the Kayse Melone Show. And again, I'm so glad you're here. I love discussing the responses to my episodes in comments on YouTube or on other platforms. So please do feel free to reach out if this conversation interests you, if you have any feedback. Again, I think this is the most important conversation we can have. And I am just grateful to participate in this life, in this podcast with you. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will see you next Sunday.